The sky above the dense Amazon canopy darkened unnaturally, a shadow cast by something too large, too deliberate to be a storm cloud. Birds scattered in frenzied bursts, their instinctive panic mirrored by every living thing on the forest floor. High above, a sleek, alien vessel emerged from the camouflage of Earth's atmosphere, its jagged, obsidian surface absorbing the sunlight rather than reflecting it. The ship hummed with power, alive and predatory, like the creatures it carried. Inside, a dozen towering beings readied themselves for the hunt. Their armor pulsed faintly, organic and metallic all at once, adapting to their powerful, sinewy frames. They were built for war, muscles coiled like steel cables beneath grayish skin adorned with scars that spoke of conquests across countless worlds. Their leader, Valeth, a being whose every movement radiated lethal precision, stood at the helm of the vessel. His eyes, twin voids glowing faintly with crimson light, scanned holographic projections of the terrain below. "This world is soft," Valeth said, his guttural voice cutting through the low hum of the ship. "Its creatures scatter. Its apex species rely on fragile shells of metal and glass for survival. Weak prey." The others responded with a chorus of approving growls, their mandibles clicking in anticipation. This was not a war. It was a culling. Valeth relished the idea. This hunt would be a trophy for their kind, a demonstration of supremacy over yet another world. The ship's underbelly hissed open, releasing a fleet of sleek, needle-like drones into the dense jungle. Their task was simple: locate human settlements, map them, and signal where the slaughter would begin. For centuries, the alien predators had hunted across the galaxy, their methods honed to an art form. Humanity, they believed, would be no different from the countless species that had fallen before them. But on the ground, things were not as straightforward as the aliens assumed. Maya Torres crouched low behind a moss-covered boulder, her breath shallow as she watched the drones zip through the trees like metallic wasps. She was part of an ecological research team that had been deep in the Amazon for weeks, studying deforestation patterns. Now, the once abstract possibility of extraterrestrial life had become a horrifying reality. "Tell me you're recording this," she whispered into her radio, her voice barely audible over the static. "I've got it," came the reply from her colleague, Dr. Daniel Greer. His voice was steady, but the undercurrent of fear was unmistakable. "These things aren't just flying around, they're scanning, triangulating. We need to move." Maya didn't argue. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, which contained a solar-powered field computer and several hard drives filled with crucial data. The forest suddenly felt oppressive, the towering trees no longer a refuge, but a labyrinth. Somewhere behind her, she could hear the faint rustle of Daniel and the others trying to keep their movements quiet. Before they could take another step, a sound cut through the air, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. One of the drones halted abruptly, its sleek body hovering midair. A red beam shot from its underside, scanning the foliage with surgical precision. Maya froze, her hand instinctively gripping the hilt of the machete at her side. It wasn't a weapon, just a tool, but in that moment it felt like her only lifeline. Then, the beam passed over her. The drone's metallic frame whirred as it shifted, almost as if it were sniffing the air. For a brief, agonizing moment, Maya thought it would continue its path. Instead, it emitted a sharp, high-pitched chirp and darted straight toward her position. "Run!" she shouted, breaking from cover. The forest exploded into chaos. Branches snapped, leaves flew, and the ground churned as the team scattered. The drone pursued Maya relentlessly, weaving through the trees with unnerving agility. She sprinted, her lungs burning, adrenaline turning seconds into an eternity. Just when she thought she couldn't push any harder, the drone's hum grew louder, almost as if it were laughing at her desperation. Then, a deafening crack split the air. The drone veered wildly, sparks erupting from its chassis as it slammed into a tree trunk. Maya skidded to a halt, her heart pounding. Standing a few meters away was Luis Mendoza, the team's guide and ex-military survivalist. He lowered the barrel of his rifle, smoke curling from the muzzle. "Keep moving," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The group reconvened a few hundred meters deeper into the jungle, their faces pale and sweat-slicked. Luis stood guard, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. "That wasn't just a reconnaissance drone," he said. "It was hunting." "We saw," Maya replied, her voice tight. "What the hell are these things?" "No idea," Luis said. "But they're not invincible. That's something." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble, distant but growing louder, rolled through the forest. Maya's stomach dropped as the realization hit her. The drone had signaled its masters. The team barely had time to react before the first of the alien hunters appeared. It moved like a shadow, its massive form slipping through the trees with eerie grace. Valeth stepped into the clearing, his crimson eyes locking onto the group. Behind him, two more of his kind emerged, their weapons gleaming like shards of blackened glass. Maya felt her throat tighten as she took in the sheer size of them. The way their armor seemed to pulse with a life of its own. These weren't creatures. They were living weapons. Valeth tilted his head, studying them with a predator's curiosity. His mandibles parted in what could almost be called a grin. "Your kind is small," he said, his voice resonating unnaturally. "Fragile." Luis raised his rifle, but before he could fire, one of the aliens moved, a blur of motion that ended with the weapon clattering to the ground, its barrel twisted like paper. Valeth stepped closer, his towering form casting a long shadow over Maya. "Run," he said, the word laced with cruel amusement. "We prefer the chase." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Luis, defiant to the last, lunged at the alien with a machete. Valeth caught the blade with one hand, snapping it effortlessly. With a single bone-jarring strike, he sent Luis crashing into a tree. That was all it took. The team scattered again, terror driving them deeper into the jungle. Maya's mind raced as she ran, every instinct screaming that they were outmatched. But as Valeth's mocking laughter echoed through the trees, a small, defiant voice rose in her mind. They might be the hunters now, but humans had survived worse. Humans had a way of turning the tables. The chase was only beginning. The rain had started hours ago, a relentless downpour that turned the dense Amazon undergrowth into a swamp of mud and slick roots. The forest, usually alive with the calls of birds and the hum of insects, had fallen into an eerie silence. The only sounds were the team's ragged breaths and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Maya pressed her back against the trunk of a massive ceiba tree, her heart pounding as she scanned the shadows for movement. Luis crouched beside her, his rifle still cradled in his arms despite its bent barrel. He had insisted on keeping it, though it was more a talisman than a weapon now. His face was set in a grim expression, his jaw tight. Nearby, Daniel fiddled nervously with a small drone they had salvaged from their research equipment, trying to modify it into something useful. His hands trembled slightly, but his focus was absolute, his mind working at a pace even fear couldn't interrupt. "They're still out there," Luis muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Watching. Waiting." Maya nodded, wiping rain and sweat from her brow. She knew he was right. The aliens were patient, deliberate. They weren't just hunting. They were studying, learning how to break their prey. It wasn't just about killing. It was about control. "We can't keep running," she whispered. "If we don't do something, they'll pick us off one by one." Luis glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you suggest? Taking them on with sticks and rocks?" "Maybe not sticks," Daniel said, not looking up from his work. "But rocks, maybe?" He held up the drone, now crudely outfitted with a bundle of small explosives from their emergency supplies. It was a primitive solution, but it might be enough to tip the scales. Luis raised an eyebrow. "You sure that'll work?" "No," Daniel admitted, finally meeting their gazes. "But it's better than waiting to die." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line as she studied the device. It was small, fragile, and unlikely to cause serious damage to something as armored as the aliens. But it could be a distraction, and distractions, she realized, might be their only chance. "What about bait?" she asked, an idea forming. We need to lure them into a position where we have the advantage. Luis gave her a skeptical look. Advantage? Against those things? Maya's voice hardened. They don't know this terrain like we do. They're used to being predators, not prey. If we can force them into a trap, just once, we might even the odds. The skepticism on Luis's face didn't fade entirely, but it softened. He nodded reluctantly. All right, what's the plan? Maya crouched, drawing a rough outline in the mud. She described a narrow ravine they had passed earlier, its steep walls lined with loose rocks and overhanging vines. If they could draw the aliens in, the unstable terrain could do the rest. It's risky, Daniel said, frowning. What if it doesn't work? Then we keep running, Maya replied simply. But it's a chance. And right now, it's the best one we've got. As they prepared, the tension between them eased slightly, replaced by a grim determination. Maya found herself watching Luis as he scouted ahead, his movements efficient and purposeful despite the pain he was clearly hiding from his earlier injuries. Daniel's nervous chatter had quieted, his focus shifting entirely to arming their crude explosives. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, they hadn't broken. It was a small thing, but it gave her hope. Hours later, the trap was set. They crouched at the edge of the ravine, hidden beneath a tangle of foliage. The small drone hovered silently beside Daniel, its explosive payload armed and ready. The forest around them was still, the air thick with anticipation. Then a sound, soft at first, barely distinguishable from the patter of rain. A low hum, rising steadily in volume. Maya's pulse quickened as she peered through the leaves, her eyes straining to see through the gloom. The first alien appeared, its massive form moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. Its armor glistened in the rain, the faint crimson glow of its eyes scanning the terrain. Behind it, two more emerged, their movements synchronized like a pack of wolves on the hunt. Maya's breath caught as Valeth stepped into view. Even among his kind, he was a force of nature, his presence exuding command and power. He paused, tilting his head slightly as if sensing the trap. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would call off the advance. Then he stepped forward, his confidence unshaken. Maya glanced at Daniel and nodded. He activated the drone, sending it buzzing toward the group. The aliens reacted instantly, their weapons snapping into place, firing thin beams of searing energy. The drone weaved through the barrage, its small size and erratic movements making it difficult to hit. Valeth growled, gesturing for his subordinates to spread out and flank the human's position. Now, Maya hissed. Luis rose from his hiding spot, hurling a makeshift Molotov at the lead alien. The glass shattered on impact, flames erupting across its armor. It roared, staggering back as the fire spread, its sensors momentarily blinded. Maya didn't wait to see if it would recover. She grabbed a length of vine and pulled with all her strength, triggering the trap. The ravine's edge gave way with a thunderous crack, sending a cascade of rocks and debris crashing down. The aliens scrambled to retreat, but the narrow path offered little room for escape. Two were caught in the avalanche, their bodies crushed beneath the weight of the falling stones. Valeth, however, moved with impossible speed. He leapt clear of the collapse, landing with a thud that shook the ground. His armor was scratched and dented, but he was unharmed. His eyes burned with fury as he locked onto Maya. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stared him down, her hand tightening around the hilt of her machete. Valeth took a step forward, but before he could close the distance, a sharp, high-pitched beep filled the air. Daniel's drone, forgotten in the chaos, had reached its target. The explosive detonated with a blinding flash, engulfing Valeth in fire and shrapnel. When the smoke cleared, he was still standing, but his armor was cracked, his movement slower. For the first time, Maya saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected: uncertainty. The group didn't wait to see if he would recover. They ran, disappearing into the forest as Valeth's enraged roar echoed behind them. The trap hadn't killed him, but it had wounded his pride. And that, Maya thought, might be enough to change the game. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. The jungle was no longer a sanctuary, nor was it merely a battlefield. It had become a hunting ground where predator and prey traded roles with every passing moment. The air was thick with humidity and the copper tang of blood, mingling with the relentless drumming of rain on leaves. Maya led the group through the labyrinth of twisted roots and underbrush, her mind calculating each step, each decision. Every movement felt deliberate now, no longer driven by panic, but by resolve. Luis, ever watchful, moved beside her, his gaze darting between the shadows. The alien leader, Valeth, was out there, wounded but far from defeated. His presence loomed over them like a storm cloud, oppressive and unyielding. Maya could feel it, his anger, his hunger to reassert dominance. He wasn't hunting for sport anymore. This was personal. "What's the plan, Maya?" Luis whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "We draw him in," she replied, her voice steady. "Force him to overcommit. He's angry, and angry means reckless." Luis grunted in approval. "Let's hope you're right. If he catches us out in the open, it's over." Daniel, trailing just behind them, struggled to keep up. He was carrying the last of their makeshift explosives, a bundle of salvage tech and raw ingenuity held together with duct tape and determination. He looked up at Maya, his glasses fogged and rain streaking his face. "Are we sure he'll come? He's smarter than the others. He might not take the bait." "He'll come," Maya said, her jaw tightening. "He needs to prove he's still the predator. And we're going to show him what it means to be human." They reached the edge of a clearing, a natural arena surrounded by towering trees whose roots created a network of trenches and hidden pockets. It was the perfect place for their final stand. Maya had chosen it deliberately, knowing the terrain would force Valeth to fight on their terms. "Set it up there," she instructed Daniel, pointing to a cluster of thick roots near the center of the clearing. He nodded and got to work, his hands moving quickly despite the trembling of his fingers. Every second felt like an eternity as they prepared, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional crack of a distant branch. Luis stood guard, his eyes scanning the tree line. "He's close. I can feel it." Maya felt it too. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that wasn't natural. She gripped her machete, her knuckles white, and forced herself to breathe. This was the moment everything had been leading to. Their chance to not just survive, but to fight back, to show that humanity wasn't weak prey to be culled. The first sign of Valeth's arrival was the sound, a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The rain slackened, as if nature itself held its breath. Then he appeared, emerging from the shadows like a phantom. His once pristine armor was scarred and cracked, blackened from the earlier explosion. But he stood tall, his crimson eyes burning with an intensity that sent a chill through Maya's spine. "You persist," Valeth said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the clearing. "You defy. I find this curious." Maya stepped forward, her machete gleaming despite the rain. "Curious enough to chase us here." Valeth tilted his head, studying her with predatory intent. "You believe yourselves clever, but cleverness will not save you." "We'll see," she shot back, her tone defiant. The alien leader moved slowly into the clearing, his steps deliberate. Maya knew he was assessing the terrain, searching for traps, but she also knew he wouldn't retreat. Not now, not when he was so close to proving his dominance. Luis flanked him silently, crouching low as he moved through the trenches created by the roots. Daniel, now hidden behind the center cluster, activated the trigger for their final trap. A faint hum filled the air, barely noticeable over the rain. Valeth paused, his gaze snapping toward the sound. "You think I cannot see your tricks?" he growled, his tone laced with contempt. "You are nothing but desperate creatures clinging to life." "Desperation's not a weakness," Maya said, her voice rising. "It's survival, and survival's what we're best at." With that, Luis sprang from his cover, firing a flare gun directly at Valeth's face. The burst of blinding light forced the alien to stumble back, his roar of anger shaking the trees. Maya seized the moment, charging forward and slashing at the weakened armor along his side. The blade struck home, embedding itself between the plates. Valeth reacted instantly, his massive arms swinging like a wrecking ball. Maya barely ducked in time, the force of the blow sending her sprawling into the mud. Luis fired again, this time aiming at Valeth's legs, forcing him to stagger. Daniel's voice crackled over their radios. Now! Maya scrambled to her feet as Daniel activated the explosives. A chain reaction erupted from beneath the roots, sending a wave of fire and debris surging toward Valeth. He roared, his form engulfed in the blast. The ground shook violently, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire clearing would collapse. When the smoke cleared, Valeth was still standing, but barely. His armor was shattered, his movements slow and labored. Blood, dark and viscous, dripped from his wounds. Yet his eyes burned brighter than ever, a mix of fury and defiance. Maya stepped forward, her machete raised. "You came here to hunt us," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her limbs. "But you forgot one thing." Valeth's gaze locked on hers, unyielding even as his body trembled. "And what is that?" "We're not just prey," she said. "We're survivors." With a final, defiant swing, Maya drove the blade into the weakened joint of his chest plate. Valeth staggered, his massive form collapsing to one knee. His breath came in ragged gasps as the light in his eyes began to fade. Luis approached cautiously, his rifle raised. "Is he?" "He's done," Maya said, her voice softer now. "But he knows it." Valeth tilted his head, a faint, almost imperceptible grin forming on his face. "Impressive," he rasped. "Perhaps. I was wrong." He collapsed fully, the weight of his body shaking the ground one last time. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the distant calls of birds returning to the forest. Maya looked at her team, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion, but alive. They had done it. Against all odds, they had turned the tables. The jungle was quiet again, but this time, it felt like victory. And yet, as Maya looked up at the sky, where faint shadows of more alien ships hovered in orbit, she knew this was only the beginning.